All right, it says I'm live and it's noon, perfect timing. So welcome, if you've just joined us. We're gonna do about 15 minutes of seated yoga. So you're welcome to find a place to sit. You might choose a chair that has a little bit harder of a seat versus like a recliner or anything like that. If a recliner is all you have, that's also an option. And so you might come to a seat. And if you're seated, you might lengthen your spine. So you might be lengthening your spine. And maybe what that means is you might find space, like you might lengthen from your hips to your ribs, and then maybe lengthen from your ribs to your armpits. And you might notice if you've lengthened through the sides of your body that way, you might notice your shoulders raised. So you might like move your shoulders more back and let them release down. And you might notice your breath. So you might be noticing your breath. I just noticed I was holding my breath. So if you ever notice that, one option is to invite the breath back in. Just by saying, oh, I can breathe. And maybe tilting your head to one side. So you might be tilting your head to one side so that maybe your ear moves in the direction of your shoulder. So you might be tilting your head to one side, maybe noticing your breath. And if your head is tilted to the side, you might bring it back to center and perhaps changing sides. So you might tilt your head the other way. So you might have your head tilted to one side, maybe noticing some sensation in the side of your neck, or you might notice it in the back of your neck. You might notice it somewhere else. You might not notice any sensation at all. And if your head is tilted to the side, you might bring it back to center and maybe lowering your chin towards your chest. So you might lower your chin towards your chest. And you could stay here, or you might roll your head from side to side. So you might move your head in semicircle, or if you'd like, you could make full circles. You have a choice. If you've been moving your head, you might bring it back to center and maybe moving your shoulders. So one way to do that might be to roll your shoulders. So you might be rolling your shoulders forward, or you could roll your shoulders back. You have a choice. And if you've been moving your shoulders, you might bring them back to center and perhaps reaching one arm up towards the sky. So you might reach one arm up towards the sky and you might stay here. Another option might be to lean to the other side. So you might place your bottom hand on the chair or couch that you're on, or on your leg, maybe leaning to one side. And if you're leaning to one side, you might notice sensation in the side of your body. You might notice it somewhere else. Or maybe not at all. And if you're leaning to the side, you're welcome to lift back up to center. And if your arm is lifted, you're welcome to lower your arm. And perhaps switching sides. So you might lift your other arm up overhead. So you might have one arm lifted. And maybe staying here, another option could be to lean to the other side. So you might be leaning to one side, perhaps placing your bottom hand on the chair that you're sitting on, or couch, or maybe on your leg or hip. You have a choice. Maybe noticing your breath. If you're leaning to one side, you might lift back up to center. If your arm is lifted, you might lower your arm. And perhaps placing your left hand on your right leg. So you might place your left hand on your right leg and maybe turning your torso towards the right. So you might turn your torso to the right, maybe placing your right hand behind you on the chair. And if you're turning to one side, you might notice some sensation in your back, maybe across your shoulders. You might notice it somewhere else, or maybe not at all. And if you're turning to one side, you might return back to center and perhaps switching sides. So you could place your right hand on your left leg and maybe turning towards the left. So you might be turning towards your left, perhaps placing your left hand behind you on the chair or couch. Maybe noticing the breath. And if you've turned to one side, you might return back to center and maybe moving through some cow-cats. So perhaps as you're inhaling, you might drop your belly forward, maybe lifting your chest, perhaps lifting your head towards the sky. And maybe as you're exhaling, you might round your spine, perhaps lowering your chin to your chest. Maybe as you're inhaling, you might move your belly forward, perhaps lifting your chest and head. Perhaps on an exhale, you might round your spine, maybe lowering your chin to your chest. And you're welcome to move between these two shapes at your own pace, maybe following your own breath. And perhaps the next time your back is rounded, you might make your way back towards seated. So you might lengthen your spine to the sky. And perhaps extending one leg out in front of you, you might lift your leg in front of you. So perhaps keeping your foot off the floor. So one option is to have your foot off the floor, maybe noticing some sensation in the top of your legs. You might notice it somewhere else, or maybe not at all. And if your leg is lifted, you might lower it. And perhaps switching sides. So you might lift your other leg off the floor. You might lift it like an inch or two off the floor. You could lift it to a 90-degree angle. You have a choice. Maybe noticing your breath. And if you haven't already, perhaps releasing. And if you'd like, you might lean back in your chair. So you might lean back in your chair so that maybe your torso is at a 45-degree angle. So you might be leaning back and perhaps noticing some sensation in your abdominals. So you might be leaning back. You might notice sensation in your abdominals. You might notice it somewhere else, or maybe not at all. And if you're leaning back, you might lift upright and perhaps extending one leg out in front of you. So you might extend one leg out in front of you, maybe placing your heel on the floor. So you might have one leg out in front of you, perhaps with your heel on the floor. And you might stay here, maybe lengthening your spine to the sky. Another option might be to hinge at your hips, maybe folding forward. So you might fold forward, perhaps placing your arms on your legs or hands on the floor. You have a choice. Maybe noticing the breath. If you're folded forward, you might lift back up and maybe switching sides. So you're welcome to extend your other leg onto the floor. You might place your heel down, perhaps lengthening your spine to the sky. And you could stay here. Another option might be to hinge at your hips, maybe placing your hands or forearms on your thighs, or you could place your hands on the floor. You have a choice. Maybe noticing some sensation in the back of your extended leg. You might notice it somewhere else. You may not notice any sensation at all. And perhaps if you're folded forward, you might lift back up and maybe bringing your foot back in. So you might place both feet on the floor, maybe lifting and spreading your toes. So you might spread your toes apart. And then maybe you might move your feet from side to side. So perhaps feeling the inner edges of your feet down, the outer edges of your feet down, the front part of your feet down, the back. And then maybe feeling all sides of the foot down. And perhaps lowering your toes. And if you'd like, on an inhale, you might reach your arms up overhead. And perhaps on an exhale, you might move your hands through heart center down by your sides. And you're welcome to do that again. Maybe inhaling, you might bring your arms up overhead. And perhaps exhaling, you might bring your arms back down by your sides. And you're welcome to continue doing that, or perhaps as you inhale, you might reach your arms overhead. Maybe as you exhale, you might fold forward, perhaps placing your hands on the floor. Maybe as you inhale, you might move your hands to the front of your shins, perhaps lifting your spine up halfway. And perhaps on an exhale, you might fold forward, maybe placing your hands on the ground. Maybe on an inhale, you might reach your arms up overhead. And perhaps on an exhale, you might bring your hands back through heart center down by your sides. You're welcome to notice the breath. Maybe noticing movement in your belly or chest as you breathe. You might notice it somewhere else. Or maybe not at all. And perhaps crossing your right leg over your left. So you might place your right ankle on your left leg. So you might have your right leg on your left leg, perhaps opening your knee to the side. So you might be here in this figure 4 shape, maybe lengthening your spine to the sky. Another option could be to hinge at your hips, maybe leaning forward. So you might be folding forward over your front leg, or you might keep your spine lifted. You have a choice. And if you're folded forward, you might lift back up. And if your right leg is crossed over your left, you might release it and maybe switching sides. So you might cross your left leg over your right. So you might have your left ankle on your right thigh, perhaps opening your knee to the side. You might stay here, perhaps lengthening your spine. Another option could be to hinge at your hips, maybe folding forward. You have a choice. Perhaps noticing sensation in the outer hip of your left leg. You might notice it somewhere else, or maybe not at all. If you're folded forward, you might lift back up to seated. If your leg is crossed over, you might place your foot back on the floor. So you might have both feet on the floor and perhaps folding forward. So one way to do that might be to place your forearms on your thighs, or you might place your hands on the floor. You have a choice. If you're folded forward, you might move back up to seated and perhaps pausing here to rest for a few breaths, maybe noticing your breath. Thank you for letting me guide your practice today. Peace. All right, I'm going to stop my YouTube video, and I have about 15 minutes.